Elara had served the Alden family for more than a decade. She lived quietly in the margins of their grand estate, her hands keeping every corner spotless, and her presence felt through the calm she left behind. Every morning she woke before dawn, lighting the kitchen fires, preparing the house for another day of order. She had never asked for more than the dignity of honest work and the peace of knowing she belonged somewhere, even if only as a servant in the shadow of wealth. The Alden mansion was a place of polished marble and silent corridors. Nathaniel Alden, the man of the house, had inherited the empire built by his late father. After the death of his wife, he had buried himself in business and grief, leaving his young son Leo in the care of his mother, Vivian, a woman whose heart had long hardened under the weight of control and status. Vivian had never liked Elara. Though she never spoke her disdain aloud, her eyes carried it in the way they followed every movement, as if waiting for the moment Elara would make a mistake. To her, servants were necessary but never truly trustworthy. She tolerated Elara because Nathaniel trusted her, and because Leo adored her. Leo, bright and curious, clung to Elara's warmth. To him, she was more than a maid. She was the gentle rhythm of his childhood, the voice that told him stories before sleep, the arms that comforted him when the world felt too big. Elara loved him in return as though he were her own child. Then, one winter morning, everything changed. The Aldens discovered that an heirloom, a sapphire pendant passed through generations, had gone missing. Panic spread through the household like fire. The jewel was priceless, not only for its value, but for what it symbolized, the family's legacy. Vivian's reaction was immediate and sharp. She turned her suspicion toward Elara, the only one, who had touched the jewelry room that week. Without investigation or hesitation, Vivian went to Nathaniel and told him what she believed was the truth. She said Elara had been desperate, that poverty had finally driven her to steal. Nathaniel listened, torn between doubt and loyalty to his mother. Her voice carried the authority of his childhood, the kind that silenced reason. Elara denied it, her voice trembling but steady. She begged them to search again, to check every drawer and safe. But Vivian's eyes were already cold. Her mind decided. Within hours, police were called. Elara was escorted from the house like a criminal, her reputation shattered in front of the staff who once respected her. The humiliation was unbearable. The neighbors watched from their windows as she was led away. Whispers followed her down the street. The same people who had smiled at her for years now turned away. She returned to her small home at the edge of town and wept until her body trembled. Her life, built on honesty and service, had collapsed in a single afternoon. The summons arrived days later, a court notice demanding her presence to face theft charges. She had no lawyer, no money, and no one to stand by her side. She wandered the town in silence, her eyes empty, her head low. The world had believed Vivian's word without question. After all, the rich were rarely wrong in the eyes of society. Yet one evening, as despair threatened to drown her completely, a soft knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, there stood Leo. His cheeks were red from the cold, his eyes wet with tears. He threw his small arms around her waist and sobbed that he didn't believe what they said. He missed her, he said. The house wasn't the same. That moment gave Elara something she hadn't felt in days, a reason to breathe. She promised the boy she would not give up. Even if the world had turned its back as the trial approached, Elara began collecting what little she could. Letters of reference, photos, testimonies from people who had known her before the Aldens. She even visited a legal aid center, where a young intern offered to help prepare her case. Though inexperienced, he treated her with kindness. For the first time, Elara saw a faint light at the end of the darkness, but in the Alden mansion, another kind of preparation was unfolding. Vivian had hired the most ruthless lawyer in the city, Victor Hawley, a man famous for defending the elite and destroying the weak. She wanted not just justice, but spectacle. The story spread through newspapers. Servant steals from the Alden seller's name became poison. She was no longer a woman. She was a symbol of betrayal, and as the day of her trial neared, the weight of injustice pressed against her chest like a stone. She prayed only for one thing. Not victory, not revenge, but the chance to tell her truth before it was buried forever. The morning of the trial arrived with gray skies and the faint chill of rain on stone. Alara stood outside the courthouse, clutching the small satchel that held her few documents, the proof of her honesty, though it felt like paper against a mountain. She wore her old work uniform, the one she had once taken pride in. Now it seemed to mock her, the symbol of a life she could no longer return to inside the courtroom. Murmurs swelled like wind in an empty hall. Reporters whispered among themselves, ready to turn another day of her humiliation into headlines. The benches were filled with curious faces, strangers hungry for scandal. Across the aisle, the Alden family sat in a neat, polished row. Vivian's eyes were as sharp as blades, her lips pressed into a thin line of satisfaction. Nathaniel sat beside her, silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Leo was not there. The boy had been kept away, told that the world of courts was no place for children. When the judge entered, silence fell. The trial began, and Victor Haller rose from his seat with the confidence of a man who had already won. His words cut through the air, elegant and cruel. He painted Alara as an opportunist who had grown too comfortable in her role, a servant who mistook trust for weakness. He spoke of greed, of ambition, of a woman who took what she believed she deserved. Ella sat still, her fingers clenched in her lap. The courtroom listened as though every accusation were truth. No one saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the tremor in her breath. The lawyer's story was far more appealing. The fall of a servant who dared to touch what belonged to her masters. When it was her turn to speak, the room shifted uneasily. Alara stood, her voice soft but steady. She spoke not in defense, but in truth. She told them she had served the Alden family faithfully, that she had cared for Leo like her own son. She explained that she had never entered the jewelry room that night, and that the accusation had shattered not only her name but her very sense of being. Few seemed moved. Some looked away out of discomfort, others in boredom. To them, she was already guilty. The media had made sure of that. Every newspaper carried her face under the word thief. Online, strangers debated her worth, her honesty, her class. They decided her guilt because of where she came from, because she was a woman who scrubbed floors in a world built for marble shoes. Nathaniel remained silent through it all. He told himself it was too late to interfere, that the process had already begun. But deep down, shame whispered inside him, the memory of Alara's laughter with Leo, the gentle steadiness of her hands. Meanwhile, Vivian thrived on the attention. She smiled faintly at the cameras, her posture regal. This was not about the jewel anymore. It was about power. The Alden name had been questioned, and she was determined to crush anyone who dared to stain it. As the days of the trial continued, witnesses came forward. Some were old servants who had once worked alongside Alara. Their words were twisted, their memories fogged by fear or loyalty to money. A few lied outright, saying they had seen her near the jewelry cabinet, that she had behaved strangely in the days before the theft. Alara listened to them, feeling the slow burn of betrayal. But she did not break in the quiet corners of the courtroom. She still carried the image of Leo, the boy who believed her when no one else did. That memory was the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the weight of their judgment outside. Storms gathered over the city, and with every headline that appeared, her world shrank further, but truth, though buried, as a way of stirring even under stone. And soon, the first cracks began to show. They stretched into weeks, and the weight of the trial began to hollow Alara from within. She lived in silence, barely eating, her body tired but her spirit refusing to die. Every morning she walked into the courthouse as if walking into a storm, Her heart heavy yet still defiant, the prosecution moved forward like a machine, relentless and polished. Vivian had ensured everything unfolded according to her design. Her lawyer, Victor Hawley, performed with cold precision, shaping truth into illusion. Each word from him was crafted to twist reality until Alara appeared not as a victim but as a schemer, hidden behind a servant's humility every day. She sat there alone, no family, no supporters, no defense strong enough to speak for her. Her court-appointed lawyer barely looked at her. He mumbled weak questions, indifferent to her fate, his eyes always drifting to the clock as if counting the minutes until it would all be over. His eyes always drifting to the clock as if counting the minutes until it would all be over. Humiliation seemed endless, but on the evening of the 6th day, when Alara returned home under the dim streetlights, there was a knock at her door. She hesitated, afraid it might be another reporter or stranger wanting a glimpse of the infamous Maid. When she opened the door, a young woman stood there holding a folder close to her chest. Her name was Arya Solis, a newly graduated lawyer who had been following Alara's case in the papers. She said she couldn't stop thinking about how wrong it all felt, how too many things didn't add up. She offered to help. Her eyes full of quiet conviction, Ella studied her face, searching for deceit, but saw only sincerity. For weeks, no one had believed her. Now, standing on her doorstep, a stranger was willing to fight for her. She nodded slowly, unable to find the words to express her gratitude from that night on. Arya became her light. They worked late into the night, sitting at Alara's small wooden table surrounded by papers and candlelight. Arya took notes, read court transcripts, and compared testimonies. She saw how statements had been manipulated, how evidence had vanished or been ignored. She found inconsistencies in the reports, times that didn't align, descriptions that contradicted each other. But the strangest discovery came when they looked into the mansion's security records. The camera that overlooked the jewelry room had been turned off the night of the theft. Not broken, turned off. Arya's eyes narrowed as she read the report. That single fact changed everything. Someone had deliberately hidden the truth. Meanwhile, inside the Alden mansion, unease began to ripple beneath the surface. The servants whispered more softly, glancing over their shoulders before speaking. Even Nathaniel felt a change, though he didn't understand it yet. He noticed Vivian's growing restlessness, the way she paced the halls at night, her perfection cracking around the edges. Leo felt it most of all. The child wandered through the mansion's long corridors, confused by the tension. He missed Alara's presence, her laughter, her gentleness. The new maids never spoke to him kindly. They moved like ghosts under Vivian's strict rules. Some nights, Leo couldn't sleep. He remembered something from the night the jewel disappeared, a faint sound in the hallway, the glow of light under a door that should have been closed when he told his grandmother. She silenced him with a smile too sharp to be kind. She said he must have dreamed it. But Leo knew what he saw as Arya prepared for the next hearing. She realized she needed to confront the Alden's narrative head-on. She couldn't fight wealth with power, but she could fight with truth. She went to the court to officially replace Alara's former lawyer. The judge hesitated at first. Arya was young, unproven, but there was something in her voice that carried weight beyond experience when she spoke. She didn't sound like a lawyer defending a lost cause. She sounded like someone who had already seen injustice and decided she would never stand by again from that moment forward. Alara was no longer alone. Vivian, however, soon heard of this new development. And though she smiled in public, a quiet unease began to grow behind her mask. She had built her life on control, of her son, of her family's name, of the truth itself. But the more she tried to tighten her grip, the more it began to slip through her fingers. Arya's investigation was only beginning, and deep within the walls of the Alden mansion, secrets long buried were starting to whisper back to life. The days after Arya's arrival felt different. Alara could sense movement, not freedom yet, but possibility. The nights that had once been filled with silence were now alive with the rustle of papers and Arya's soft voice mapping out timelines, cross-checking statements, drawing connections that others had ignored. Arya wasn't just determined. She was intuitive. She saw patterns where others saw noise, and she had a way of listening that made Alara feel human again. Together, they revisited every memory, every moment of that cursed night. Alara described the sounds in the hallway, the missing key, the way Vivian had entered the jewelry room earlier that day under the pretense of cleaning the heirlooms bit by bit. A shadow of truth began to take shape. Arya went further. She visited the courthouse archives, searching for every report, every statement. What she found confirmed her suspicions. The investigation had been handled carelessly. The report on the disabled security camera was vague, too vague. It mentioned a malfunction, but the timestamp of its shutdown matched exactly with the moment the jewel disappeared. Someone had switched it off intentionally when Arya showed Alara the report. The older woman pressed her hands together and whispered a single line. She did this. Alara didn't have to say the name. They both knew who she meant. Meanwhile, the Alden mansion stood like a fortress of silence. Behind its polished doors, fear began to stir. Vivian's control had always been uncheckable, her word absolute, but something about the trial's direction made her uneasy. The appearance of a new lawyer, young, relentless, and with no fear of wealth, was an irritation she couldn't ignore. She summoned Victor Hawley to the house, ordering him to speed up the case. She wanted Alara discredited and silenced before this new threat could gain ground. Hawley, loyal to money more than truth, nodded obediently, promising to finish it soon. Nathaniel watched quietly from the corner of the study. He had grown used to his mother's dominance, but even he could see that her poise was beginning to crack. When he tried to speak of doubt, Vivian dismissed him with a wave, telling him he was too soft, that emotions had no place when protecting the family name. Nathaniel said nothing more, but her words cut deeper than she realized. Leo felt the unease most of all. The house that once glowed with laughter now echoed with whispers. His grandmother hovered near him constantly, pressing gifts into his hands, distracting him with toys and promises of amusement parks. Yet beneath her smiles, he sensed tension, the kind that made the air heavy sometimes. Late at night, he heard her voice from the study. Once he tiptoed close and saw her through the cracked door, standing before a small wooden box with a golden clasp. The same kind of box his mother used to keep her jewelry in. Vivian's hand trembled slightly as she opened it, staring at something inside before quickly closing it again. Leo backed away silently, confusion clouding his young mind when he asked about it the next morning. Vivian laughed, too quickly, too sharply. She told him he must never mention such things again. That children who meddle in grown-up matters bring trouble upon themselves. Leo said nothing, but her warning carved itself into his heart like ice. Arya, unaware of the danger stirring inside the mansion, kept pushing forward. She began speaking with former staff members who had worked for the Aldens. Most refused to talk, afraid of losing what little they had. But one elderly housekeeper agreed to meet her privately. With trembling hands, she told Arya she had once seen Vivian entering the jewelry room late that night, long after everyone had gone to bed. Before Arya could ask more, the woman stopped. Fear filled her eyes. She whispered that she couldn't afford to speak further, that the Alden's reach was long and unforgiving. That single sentence told Arya everything she needed to know. Truth was close, too close. Alara, sensing the shift, grew restless. Hope was dangerous. She had learned that too many times. But Arya's faith was unshakable. The young lawyer spoke with quiet fire, telling her that the world could ignore lies only for so long. Eventually, truth always found its way to the surface, even if it had to claw through stone to breathe. Vivian, meanwhile, could feel that same truth closing in. She began holding secret meetings, dismissing servants, and tightening control over every corner of her home. She wanted no cracks left for light to enter. But truth, like water, finds even the smallest fracture, and inside that mansion, behind its marble walls and velvet curtains, the first drops of truth had already begun to seep through. Asterisk. The week before the trial's turning point felt like the calm before a storm, the kind that hums in the bones before lightning splits the sky. Ilara barely slept. She sat by the window at night, staring at the street lamps, wondering how long a lie could survive before it destroyed itself. Arya spent those same nights surrounded by papers, connecting fragments of forgotten evidence. She had learned to trust her instincts, and they told her something vital was being hidden in plain sight. When she compared the official reports with society news columns from the same week, she noticed something strange. 3 days after the supposed theft, Vivian Alden had attended a charity gala hosted by the governor's wife. Arya studied the article closely, scanning the photo that accompanied it. Vivian stood proudly beside other guests, her posture regal, her smile rehearsed, and around her neck shimmered a familiar blue light, a sapphire. The photograph was slightly blurred, but Arya knew what she was looking at. The missing jewel, the same pendant for which Ilara's life had been torn apart, was hanging openly at Vivian's throat. For a moment, Arya simply stared, unable to breathe. Then she printed the image and rushed to Ilara's home. When Ilara saw it, she covered her mouth, trembling. Her suspicion had finally found a face. That night, hope flickered to life, but the next morning, when Arya tried to retrieve the same photograph online, it was gone. The article had been quietly removed. The archive showed no record of it ever existing. Calls to the publication were met with polite refusals. The event's coverage, they said, had been edited for privacy. Arya understood immediately. Vivian's influence ran deep, far beyond courtrooms and gossip. Still, she refused to give up. She began contacting guests who had attended the gala, asking subtle questions, searching for anyone who might remember the sapphire. Most hesitated, afraid to speak against the Aldens. But one woman quietly admitted that she had indeed seen Vivian wearing a necklace that caught the light like ocean water. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a thread strong enough to pull. Meanwhile, within the Alden mansion, unease thickened like fog. Vivian felt the invisible shift in the air. Though she continued her days as usual, directing staff, arranging flowers, maintaining appearances, her nights were restless. She began locking her office, hiding keys, and dismissing servants who asked too many questions. Nathaniel noticed. He had been avoiding his mother's eyes for weeks, consumed by doubt. The photograph Arya had discovered hadn't reached him yet, but guilt was already seeping into his soul. He remembered Ilara's calm voice, her dedication, her kindness. He remembered the way Leo used to light up whenever she entered the room, and every time he passed her empty quarters in the mansion. He felt the ache of a wrong not yet righted. Leo's memories, too, were growing sharper. The flashes of that night came to him in dreams. The glint of light under a door, the soft creak of the floorboards, his grandmother's shadow moving through the hallway. He remembered her whispering something, words that had sounded heavy and secret, when he tried to tell his father. Nathaniel dismissed it gently, thinking it was a child's imagination. But Vivian, overhearing, stepped in before he could continue. She smiled sweetly at Leo, pressing a candy into his hand. "Don't trouble yourself with old stories," she said. "Grown-ups handle these things." Her tone was soft, but her eyes made Leo's stomach twist. After that, she watched him closely. She could tell he was remembering more than she wanted. To keep control, she filled his days with distractions, games, toys, new lessons. But children are harder to fool than most believe. Leo had seen too much Arya, unaware of the silent battle inside the mansion, prepared for the next hearing. She had no solid proof yet, but she had momentum, and she knew that Vivian was hiding something the night before court resumed. Arya met Alara on the edge of town beneath the streetlights. The wind carried the scent of rain, and their breath turned to mist in the cold air. Arya told her she believed they were close. The missing photograph might have vanished, but the truth couldn't be erased forever. Nodded slowly. Her faith in justice had been shattered once, but Arya's determination had rebuilt a fragment of it. She realized that even if the world was deaf to the poor, sometimes a single brave voice could echo loud enough to shake it awake inside the Alden mansion. Vivian stood before the mirror, fastening the same sapphire pendant around her neck. She watched her reflection carefully, the jewel glowing like a captured sky. Her hand lingered on it for a moment, her expression hard to read. Pride, fear, or perhaps defiance outside. Thunder rolled in the distance, and for the first time, even she began to wonder how long the lie could last before the storm arrived. The morning of the third day in court began quietly. The air inside the building was thick, as though everyone could sense something about to shift. Alara sat near the front, her back straight despite the exhaustion etched into her bones. Beside her, Arya organized her papers, every motion calm but precise. She had spent the night preparing for whatever might come. Facts, questions, even silence, across the aisle. Vivian sat like a queen upon a throne she refused to surrender. Her lawyer, Victor Hawley, whispered strategies in her ear, but she barely listened. She believed the battle was already won. Nathaniel sat beside her, withdrawn, his hands clasped together, his mind elsewhere. The trial proceeded as before. Hawley spoke with his usual polished cruelty, painting Alara as a liar and a thief, while the crowd nodded along, hungry for scandal. Arya countered where she could, but without hard proof. Her words still felt like whispers against thunder. Then the courtroom doors opened, and Chaos walked in. Leo slipped through the crowd, having escaped the nanny who was meant to keep him away. His small figure moved down the aisle with a kind of fearless innocence that no adult could command. For a moment, no one noticed him. Then a murmur spread through the room as the boy ran straight to Alara and threw his arms around her waist. The courtroom froze. Alara looked down, her eyes wide in disbelief. She felt his heartbeat against her hands, the warmth of the child she thought she'd lost forever. Before she could speak, Leo turned to the judge, his voice trembling but loud enough to fill the chamber. "She didn't do it," he said. "I know who did." The words cracked through the silence like lightning. Reporters gasped. The judge called for order, but the room erupted in whispers and flashes from cameras. Vivian's face drained of color. Nathaniel half rose from his chair, unsure whether to stop his son or shield him. Alara stood frozen as Leo continued, his small voice trembling but steady. He told them he had woken one night for a glass of water and seen his grandmother in the jewelry room. He described the light glowing under the door, the sound of her voice whispering to herself. He remembered the sparkle of something in her hand, the same sapphire pendant that was now missing. She said. Leo paused, struggling to recall the exact words. His voice dropped to a whisper. She said Alara would be an easy target. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Vivian's mask faltered. Her hand gripped the armrest of her chair, the knuckles pale as marble. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Victor Hawley jumped to his feet, objecting at a flurry of legal jargon. He insisted that the boy was too young, that his memories were unreliable, that children confuse dreams with truth, but Leo didn't waver. He repeated his story, describing the small wooden box with a golden clasp, the same one Vivian kept locked in her office. His details were too exact to dismiss. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Arya seized the moment, rising from her seat. Her voice, calm and deliberate, filled the silence. "Your Honor," she said, "this testimony cannot be ignored." The boy's memory matches previous inconsistencies in the case: the disabled security camera, the timing of the events, and the defendant's repeated insistence on her innocence. "We request a formal investigation into this new evidence." Vivian finally spoke then, her voice sharp but unsteady. She accused Alara of manipulating the child, of planting lies in his mind. But the courtroom no longer looked at her with reverence. Something had shifted. The image of control she'd worn for so long had begun to crack. Nathaniel, unable to bear it any longer, stood and looked at his son, then at Alara. The weight of guilt pressed down like iron. He realized how blind he had been, how willingly he had let his mother's authority erase his own judgment when the judge ordered a recess to investigate Leo's claim. Vivian's calm exterior collapsed. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, her hands trembling. Around her, the crowd buzzed with whispers and disbelief. Alara stood in silence, her heart pounding. She didn't know whether to cry or collapse, but Arya placed a steady hand on her arm. "This is it," Arya whispered. "The truth has found its way," and his guards escorted the Alden family from the room for questioning. Alara and Leo remained together for a moment longer. The boy clung to her tightly, whispering that he had been afraid but couldn't stay quiet anymore. Ella knelt and touched his face gently, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. For the first time in months, they were tears of relief in that moment. The courtroom no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning, the moment when lies began to unravel under the unflinching light of truth outside. Rain began to fall, soft and steady against the courthouse windows, and somewhere inside that storm, justice had begun to stir. The mansion that had once glimmered with pride now felt like a tomb of silence. After the courtroom chaos, the press camped outside the gates, their cameras waiting for any glimpse of scandal. Inside, tension hung thick enough to choke. Vivian had locked herself in her office, her curtains drawn tight. She told the world she was unbothered, that children's words held no weight against her reputation. But behind the door, her composure was unraveling thread by thread. Nathaniel stood in the hall outside that office for what felt like hours. He could still hear Leo's trembling voice echoing in his mind. The picture his son had painted, the glow under the door, the whisper, the box, fit too perfectly with what he himself had ignored for years. Finally, he turned the handle and stepped inside. Vivian sat at her desk, pretending to read, though her hands shook slightly. When she saw her son, her expression hardened. She didn't need to ask why he had come. Nathaniel closed the door quietly behind him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The air between them was sharp with unspoken things. Then he asked the question that had been burning inside him since the trial. Was Leo telling the truth? Vivian's eyes narrowed. She told him not to be absurd, that the child had been manipulated, that grief and guilt had confused his memory. But her voice lacked conviction, and Nathaniel could hear the lie in it. He pressed harder, his tone shaking now. He spoke of the night that Jewel vanished, the sudden shutdown of the camera, the way she had insisted on handling everything herself. He spoke of her years of control, of how she had shaped him into silence. Vivian's composure cracked. She stood abruptly, her voice rising in defense, insisting that everything she did was to protect the family. But the mask had fallen, and the truth spilled out with the bitterness of old resentment. She confessed not in guilt, but in fury. She said Alara had grown too close to Leo, to Nathaniel, even to the heart of the house itself. She said the boy saw her as a mother, and Nathaniel had begun to rely on her. Vivian feared that soon Alara would replace her, that her influence would fade in her own home when the jewel disappeared. She had seen an opportunity to remind everyone who held the true power in the Alden family. She never meant for it to go so far. She only wanted to frighten Alara, to remove her quietly. But when suspicion fell naturally her way, She let it grow. Each word cut Nathaniel like glass. Saw then how deep his mother's fear of losing control had run, how it had turned love into cruelty. He realized that by standing silent, he had been her accomplice without another word. He turned from her and began searching the office. Vivian tried to stop him, but Nathaniel's anger had hardened into resolve. He moved aside books, opened drawers, until his hand fell upon the cabinet in the corner. The one Leo had described behind it. Hidden under layers of ledgers, he found a small safe. The combination came to him instinctively. It was the same one his father had once used for important family records. When the door clicked open, the truth gleamed back at him. There it was, the sapphire pendant, carefully wrapped in silk. And beside it, stacks of envelopes, cash, and old documents that hinted at other manipulations buried through the years. Nathaniel stared at it all in silence. Vivian tried to speak, her tone cracking now. She begged him to understand that everything she had done was for the preservation of their legacy. But Nathaniel saw no legacy left, only the ruins of one built on fear. He took the jewel, locked the safe behind him, and left the room outside. The hallway seemed to exhale after years of holding its breath. That night, Nathaniel drove to the police station. He didn't think, didn't pause, didn't worry about scandal. He handed over the sapphire and told them everything. The officer on duty listened in silence, his pen scratching across the report as Nathaniel confessed how his mother had hidden the jewel, how he had ignored the signs, how a woman had lost everything because of their pride. The story spread through the city before morning. The same newspapers that had once branded Alara a thief now printed a new headline: The Alden Family Scandal. Hidden jewel found. Vivian's empire of lies had begun to crumble back in her home. She sat in the darkness of her office, her hands trembling as flashes of camera lights flickered through the window from the gates below. For the first time in her life, her name, once untouchable, was spoken with scorn. Alara, reading the news the next morning, said nothing. She just placed a hand over her chest and wept softly, not from vengeance, but from release. Arya smiled faintly across the table. The truth, she said, finally learned how to speak, but they both knew this was not the end. Not yet, because the courtroom still awaited the reckoning, and for Vivian Alden, the day she had ruled others' fates would soon become the day she faced her own asterisk. The day of the final hearing arrived with a heavy stillness. The courthouse was overflowing. Reporters, onlookers, and those who had once whispered about Alara's guilt now came to witness the collapse of a legacy. Alara sat quietly beside Arya, her hands folded, her eyes downcast. She looked fragile, but her presence carried a quiet power, the strength of someone who had endured the storm and now stood in its calm across the aisle. Vivian entered with her lawyer, her once commanding figure smaller now, wrapped in a dark coat that did little to conceal her trembling. The crowd's murmur followed her like a shadow. She had become the spectacle she had once enjoyed watching others endure. Nathaniel sat a few rows behind, his expression hollow. He had surrendered the evidence himself. The pendant, the documents, the confession. The truth had freed him from the silence that had defined his life, but it had also destroyed the only family he had ever known. When the judge called the session to order, the air grew still. Arya rose, her voice calm but sharp as glass. Your Honor, she began, we present physical evidence recovered from the Alden estate, the missing sapphire pendant, discovered in the possession of Vivian Alden. Along with it, correspondence confirming deliberate concealment of the item and an intent to frame the defendant. Alara Winne gasp moved through the courtroom. Cameras flashed. Vivian tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced her. She looked to her lawyer, but even Victor Hale's mask of arrogance had fractured. He knew the battle was lost. Arya continued, her tone steady. For months, my client was humiliated, isolated, and publicly condemned for a crime she did not commit. She lost her livelihood, her home, and her dignity, all to preserve the illusion of purity around a family that valued power more than truth. Vivian finally spoke then, her voice brittle but loud enough to carry. She said she had made a mistake, that fear had clouded her judgment, that she had only wanted to protect her family. But no apology could erase what she had done. The judge listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Alara. "Do you wish to address the court?" "Yes," Alara rose slowly. Her voice, when it came, was soft but resonant, the kind of voice that silences even whispers. "I served that family for 12 years, she said. "I cared for their child, I tended their home, and I believed loyalty was enough to earn trust. But I learned that in some worlds, truth means nothing when spoken by the poor. You can lose everything simply because someone richer points their finger." Her eyes met Vivian's then, not in anger, but in sorrow. "I do not hate you," she said quietly, "but I pity you, because a person who trades their soul for control will never know peace." The silence that followed was deep and absolute. Even the reporters stopped writing when the judge delivered his ruling. His words were clear. All charges against Alara were dismissed. The court recognized her innocence, and an order was issued to investigate the conduct of Vivian Alden and Victor Hawley for obstruction of justice. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed. Like thunder, Vivian's body slumped slightly in her chair, her face pale and distant. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply sat as if turned to stone. Her empire of deception crumbling around her. Nathaniel stood slowly, his eyes full of regret. He tried to speak to Alara as she gathered her belongings, but she only shook her head. "There's nothing left to say," she whispered. "What was broken cannot return to what it was." He nodded, tears burning in his eyes, and watched her walk away outside. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters shouting questions. Arya shielded Alara as they made their way through the crowd. Flashbulbs flared, microphones thrust forward, and voices demanded to know what she would do now that she was free. Alara paused for a moment on the last step, the wind tugging at her coat. "I will live," she said simply, "and that will be enough." The words were quiet, but they carried farther than any headline by nightfall. The world that had once condemned her now spoke her name with reverence. The story spread not as a tale of scandal, but of endurance, of a woman who stood against power and walked away unbroken. Vivian, meanwhile, returned to her mansion alone. Reporters followed her only so far. Even the media seemed to lose interest once her mask fell. The estate that had once symbolized prestige now felt hollow, its corridors echoing with the silence of absence. She wandered those halls like a ghost among memories, her reflection in the grand mirror no longer recognizable. The sapphire pendant sat on the table before her, stripped of its worth. It no longer shimmered. It only mocked her with its quiet beauty. For the first time, she realized that all her victories had been built on fear, and fear was the most fragile empire of all. Weeks passed before the noise began to fade. The headlines that had once shouted Alara's name slowly gave way to new scandals, new distractions. The world moved on, as it always did, but the lives left in the wreckage had changed forever. Alara did not return to the Alden mansion, nor did she try. The memories tied to those walls were too heavy to bear. She sold what little she owned and moved to a quieter part of the city, a small apartment above a flower shop owned by an old woman who had once hired her to clean many years ago. The woman asked for no rent until Alara could afford it, saying the city owed her that much after what it had taken each morning. Alara woke to the scent of fresh blooms drifting through her window. She began helping at the shop, tending to the plants, arranging bouquets, learning the language of petals instead of polish and dust. It was quiet work, honest work, and for the first time in her life, she felt a calm that did not depend on anyone's approval. Arya visited often. Her name had begun to circulate in legal circles as the young lawyer who had faced one of the city's most powerful families and won. But she never boasted. When she visited Ilara, she came not as an attorney, but as a friend. They shared tea, silence, and laughter that felt like healing one afternoon as they sat among the flowers. Arya told her that the case had inspired new policies to protect workers from defamation by employers. "Your story," she said softly, "is already changing things for others." Celera smiled faintly. Then, maybe it was worth the pain, but her nights were still haunted by memories. Sometimes she woke in the dark, hearing echoes of the courtroom, the click of the gavel, the murmur of strangers judging her life. And yet, unlike before, she did not weep. She would rise, light a candle, and remind herself that survival was its own kind of victory in another part of the city. The Alden mansion stood quiet. Most of the staff had left. Nathaniel had taken Leo and moved away, determined to give his son a simpler life, one untouched by the poison of legacy. Before they left, he wrote to Ilara, a letter she received weeks later. In it, he apologized not as a master to a servant, but as a man to another human being. He confessed his blindness, his cowardice, and his wish that she would one day forgive him. At the end of the letter, Leo had added a few lines in his childish handwriting. "I remember your stories. I miss you. I'm sorry for everything they did." Ilara pressed the letter to her heart. She never replied, not because she was angry, but because some wounds are meant to close quietly, without reopening the scar. Vivian, meanwhile, had withdrawn from public life entirely. Her trial was brief, her punishment lighter than it should have been. Wealth still held its privileges, but the greater sentence was solitude. The world that once obeyed her no longer looked her way. The mansion became her exile. She spent her days pacing the gardens she once ordered others to tend, her mind replaying the choices that had led her here. Pride had been her crown, control her weapon. Now both had turned to dust in her hands. Sometimes she thought of Ilara, not with hatred, but with something more painful, envy. Because Ilara, though stripped of everything, had found peace. And peace was the one thing Vivian could no longer buy back in the city. Arya's career flourished. She was offered positions at prestigious firms, but turned most of them down. She preferred to defend those who had no voice, the kind of people who, like Ilara, lived unseen until the world needed someone to blame. She said Ilara's case had taught her that the law could only serve justice if someone dared to look beyond money, and Ilara often watched her friend from afar, proud in silence. She never sought fame, but she understood that the truth, once spoken, has a way of echoing through others. One evening, as the sun sank over the city, Ilara closed the flower shop and stepped outside. The sky burned with streaks of crimson and gold. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the fading light, feeling the wind brush against her face like forgiveness. She had lost her old life. But something greater had taken root, a sense of quiet dignity, the kind that no accusation could destroy again. In that stillness, she realized something she had never dared to believe. She was free. Years drifted like pages turning in an old book. The storm that once consumed every headline faded into history, becoming one more story whispered by those who had lived through it and forgotten by those who had not. But for those whose souls had been marked by it, time did not erase. It transformed. Ilara's hair had grown silver by the time peace truly took root in her life. She still lived above the flower shop, still rose before dawn to tend the blooms. The old woman who had once owned the shop had passed it on to her before leaving the world quietly, and now Ilara ran it herself. Her hands, though older, remained gentle, steady, and kind. The same hands that had once scrubbed marble floors now coaxed life from soil customers, came not just for flowers, but for her presence. They said the shop felt like sunlight even on dark days. Children would visit just to listen to her soft voice, tell them stories about courage, kindness, and truth, stories without names. though the echoes of her own past lingered within each one's. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the glass. Older, lined, but peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't come from comfort, but from survival. The kind that has looked at ruin and chosen stillness instead of bitterness. Arya visited often, her career now well known, but her heart unchanged. She had become a quiet force in the city, not loud, not political, but powerful in the way truth is powerful when it refuses to bow. She still called Elara teacher, saying that everything she had achieved began the day she chose to fight for a woman everyone else had. Already condemned, they would sit together in the evenings, the scent of jasmine and earth filling the air, and talk about nothing in particular, just the small details that make ordinary days sacred in those moments. The past felt far away, like a dream that had once been sharp, but had since blurred into memory. Nathaniel never returned to the mansion. He sold the estate and moved abroad with Leo, who had grown into a young man with a quiet strength that mirrored Alara's. He studied art, preferring colors to arguments, and painted scenes filled with light and forgiveness. On the back of one canvas, he wrote, "For the woman who taught me truth." He sent it anonymously to the flower shop years later. When Alara received it, she recognized his hand immediately. She hung it near the window where sunlight could strike it every morning. It showed a small garden beneath an open sky, a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she had found. As for Vivian Alden, her name faded from conversation. The last anyone heard, she lived quietly in the countryside, surrounded by silence. The press no longer cared for her, and society had found new idols to adore and destroy. She spent her days walking the edge of a lake near her house, her reflection rippling across the surface like a ghost. Some say she regretted everything. Others said she never spoke of it again. But on certain evenings, she would be seen sitting by the water as the sun fell, the sapphire pendant glinting faintly in her hand, not worn, not hidden, just held. Perhaps she kept it as a reminder of what pride had cost her, and so, time, patient, unjudging, did what courts and words could not. It balanced what life had broken. It gave silence to the restless, purpose to the lost, and peace to the undeserving. One spring morning, Alara sat outside her shop as dawn spread its first light. The air was cool, the streets still half asleep. A small bird landed on the railing beside her, its feathers catching the sun. She smiled faintly. She thought of the years behind her, of the injustice that had nearly destroyed her, the courage that had rebuilt her, and the truth that had finally set her free. She thought of the faces that had once looked at her with accusation and now existed only as ghosts in memory. And then she thought of the child who had stood in a courtroom and spoken the truth when no one else dared. The boy who had changed everything with a single act of courage. She whispered a blessing into the morning air, though no one heard it but the wind. For those who speak truth when silence is easier, she murmured. May their hearts never lose their light. The bell of the flower shop chimed as a customer entered. Alara rose, her movements slow but graceful, and stepped inside. The sun climbed higher, bathing the street in gold. Life continued, soft, ordinary, beautiful, and in that quiet moment, the story of the maid who had once been called a thief finally dissolved into peace, not forgotten, but transformed into something greater, because truth, when it endures long enough, stops being a weapon. It becomes a seed, and Alara had learned that even the smallest seed, once buried, will one day bloom again.